Greetings to everyone on my channel. Sit back. Now you will listen to another incredible story about the relationship of a married couple and the incredible exposure of his wife. I will ask you to subscribe to my channel and like it. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me. Ivan habitually woke up at 5 a.m., having not set an alarm for this for a long time. It was already quite light outside. It was summer outside. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog was barking insistently and roosters were actively shouting over each other. Sitting on an old high wrought iron bed, his legs dangling, he stretched with a crunch and, scratching his leg, looked with a smile at the snoring young girl sleeping next to him. She was lying on her back, sprawled out, and almost the entire upper part of her naked body peeked out from under the tangled blanket. After admiring the big breasts with night bedsores for a few seconds, the guy quietly and gently touched them and carefully pulled up the blanket, covering the sleeping beauty. "Mm." She still opened her big blue eyes and whispered, "Vanyusha, don't go away." "Business," he sighed, and leaning over kissed her full lips. "And you go to sleep, Marussia. Go to sleep, honey. It's still early." The girl squeezed his hand with her warm palms, pressed it to her face, and quickly fell asleep. Carefully freeing his brush, Ivan got up and, stroking the sweetly sniffing blonde's hair, dressed and left the room. Several times, having completely dipped his head into a container made of a huge Kiravet's tire, into which rainwater was collected from the roof of the house, he dried himself and went into the summer kitchen. After making himself a cup of hot, natural chicory, he went out into the yard and lit a cigarette and sat down on a bench, yawning loudly. After waiting for the mother to milk the cow, and having driven the long-horned Knight and her retinue of sheep to the outskirts, to the village shepherd gathering the herd, the guy took care of the rest of the animals and birds. After giving the animals food, Ivan, reluctantly, obeying his mother's reminder, and while it was cool, dug up a decent plot in the front garden for a new portion of table greens. And only then, having washed slightly under the summer shower at the bathhouse, I had breakfast with fresh eggs with tomatoes and yesterday's pies. After lying down for half an hour, digesting food, under a canopy attached to the house, I went to the lower one, by the pond, a vegetable garden. There was a plot of Granny, whom Ivan hardly remembered, who lived there in a very small house, so after her death the plot simply became a second vegetable garden, and the house was a junk warehouse. However, Ivan kept one of the two miniature rooms in an almost divine form from his youth, because since high school, he brought and satisfied girls there, on an antediluvian, very hard sofa, with folding side cushions and a narrow rectangular mirror built into the upper part of a high and straight backrest. Going down the blurred and broken sloping road to the pond, which was the street of the same name, that is, the pond street on which their house stood, Ivan, passing by an unsightly dwelling that had long dreamed of fresh paint, heard swearing coming from his yard. Drunkard Fyodor, as usual, had been brawling since the morning, demanding a hangover. And Nyurka, as usual, loudly told him to fuck off and inclined him in a different way too. Fedya jumped out through the gate just as Ivan was passing by, and with difficulty focusing his cloudy, watery eyes, but still recognizing, immediately offered, "Vanka, hello. Will you satisfy her?" Pointing with his finger at the thick-set red-haired woman who came out next. "For the bottle. What are you talking about?" She was indignant and easily dragged the skinny man back into the yard, having managed to wink at the guy. Fedor took Nura into his house, with his daughter, after her hut burned down, along with her husband. Everything in the new family was relatively good and quiet, except for the man's addiction to moonshine. While Ivan, one day, at the request of his mother, who found out and sent him, came and severely smashed Fedya's face because he was molesting a little girl drunkenly. This was enough to put him off once and for all, but along the way, the drunk was absolutely sure that the defender of the baby was the lover of his common-law wife. It was impossible to convince him, and thus Fedya began to offer his wife to Ivan at every meeting. After a while, realizing and trying to benefit from it as a bubble, in addition, Ivan sent him to the farm and threatened to smash his face. But it did not help, because it did not go beyond threats. And all because Fyodor was absolutely right about something. Ivan's neighbor, Grandfather Thomas, had been selling moonshine for a long time, which he drove nonstop since the 90s, and one evening, after those educational beatings, Nyurka came to ask her grandfather for a bubble, her husband dying of a hangover. She had no money, and her grandfather did not lend money to debtors again. Ivan, who took pity, bought a bottle for the woman, and as a result, a grateful and hungry woman immediately invited him to her bathhouse for a gratitude procedure. Ivan, without thinking twice, agreed and took the second bottle from his grandfather. Winking back at the woman, Vanka thought that he had not visited her for a long time, and Nura, who stuck her head back out onto the street, asked the same thing. "Do you want to repeat the procedure, Vanek?" She, who works as a paramedic in the village medical center, smiled broadly, which affected her vocabulary. "I want a Nur. Let's come on Wednesday, in the evening?" The guy suggested softly, remembering the elastic breasts of a quite pretty woman. "Okay," she smiled, nodding repeatedly. "I'll be waiting for you about 9 o'clock. Nyurka!" Fyodor roared somewhere behind the fence, and she returned to the yard. "Well, pour it. Be a man." "Yes, I will. But don't scream, you bastard." The cheerful woman laughed, and Ivan, going further, greeted the woman of the fields, sitting and knitting something for her granddaughters, on a bench near his house, and stomping to the gate of the next one, stretched out his hand to Kostya, her son, a puny man who started his dark green Ural with a stroller. "Go to the city?" he asked, shaking hands. "Bring a block of red LM, then I will not give the money with me." "Yeah, into him, darling. I will buy." "There's a lot to do in the afternoon. You need to have time to stock up on the list of daughters, and your mother still needs medicines." I drove. He smiled, pulled on a helmet and drove away, raising a cloud of dust. Konstantin was called Lot in the village, because they knew for sure that after burying his wife, he lived with his two daughters as with women. He had already taken the eldest to an abortion, and it was after that the youngest got to the organ of a loving father, replacing the eldest, eventually joining for good. Their grandmother Polya calmed down, not particularly steaming people, saying that she asked the girls directly, and they confirmed that there was no violence, everything was by mutual desire. So fuck them, perverts, the public thought, and continued to go about their business. Moreover, the girls are scary and harmful. That's why they gave themselves to their father, something that no one else needed, the villagers believed. Although the eldest daughter did meet with a guy, though from a neighboring village, and even talked about a wedding, and they also said that her father was very unhappy with this, for obvious reasons. But the younger one actively tried to get pregnant from her father, and he had to give her birth control pills. Having finished with the small tasks in the garden, Ivan reached a pond located very close by and plunged into the pond water, swam a little in cold water. He was accompanied only by a flock of kids splashing along the shore, who came running from a huge house that stood almost by the water, which was once a village club. Now there was a shop at the end, and everything else was occupied by a large family with 15 children. The eldest of them had already started their own families, and the youngest was at most a couple of years old. But the villagers firmly knew that the head of the house, Dmitri, had long been infertile. His mistress Marinka, a shop assistant who sometimes moonlights as a nanny, found out and roused him. And his children continued to appear every year or two. And since the whole street comes to the hostess's house for various reasons, these children were called street children, meaning exactly that their fathers are distributed all over the street, but not one by one. That's just where and whose is not, we found out. Ivan looked at a very, very fat woman who came out to drive the children, and even mentally rejected the option to replenish the collection of this obviously child-loving plump uterus. Moreover, loving in every sense, there was a lot of gossip in the village that she independently makes her sons men, and who knows, maybe she gave birth to one of them. And they also talked about the older children who got married among themselves, just because they had been living together in secret for a long time. With a knowing chuckle, he dressed and cheerfully stomped towards the house, on the other side of the road, to go to the spring, with the buckets he had thoughtfully captured. The spring was located in the Malakayev's garden, but access to it was free, through a separate gate in the garden. To take a shortcut, Ivan walked through a small abandoned area with ashes, the remains of the house where Nyurka and her husband Peter once lived. After standing by the coals overgrown with grass and a lonely protruding pipe, already almost hidden by young trees. Ivan remembered Petka with a kind word and crossed himself went on, thinking that the fire happened for a reason. There were rumors that he got caught repeatedly cheating with his neighbor Svetka, for which he paid. But Ivan did not want to ask Nura directly about this. He would be offended, but he would stop giving, and he had not yet had enough. I'll ask when I get tired of her, he decided, already about to climb over the fence to the spring, so as not to go around. Ivan, hearing strange sounds and almost immediately determining their essence, cautiously crept up to a heavily overgrown creeper corner. Through the thicket he saw the following picture. Standing with Cancer, Svetka Malakiva, once again, cheated on her husband with her neighbor Koka. Spreading her thick, bare legs wide apart, shod in canvas boots, she breathed hoarsely, taking in the hurried thrusts of a panting, wiry man who had not even undressed, but simply pulled down his trousers. The slaps of touching bodies attracted Ivan's attention. For a while, he stared in fascination at the waves radiating from a very plump ass to huge, swaying breasts, completely freed by a pulled-up t-shirt. Svetka began to moan a little and independently gagged herself with her own skirt lying next to her. The sweatshirt on which the lovers were kneeling seemed familiar to the attentive guy, but he was not fond of voyeurism and moved away from the fence. Sitting down on the grass, Ivan lit a cigarette and smoked another cigarette before the slaps and puffing turned into short-lived loud moans and a satisfied mutter. When everything calmed down and the lovers parted, the guy, after waiting a little longer, jumped over the fence and ran nose to nose with a lurking Svetka, who, smiling, said, "Oh, it's you, Vanka. I thought so, except for you. No one walks through that yard. They're afraid." She grinned slyly. "Did you peep? I need it. I just didn't want to get in the way, so I waited." Ivan shrugged. "Well, thank you. Don't you want me?" Svetka asked breathlessly, making eyes. "Isn't it enough for you to have a husband and Koka?" Ivan was surprised. "It's fine. It's enough. But I don't mind. And I've been wanting to try it with two for a long time. And you can't call your husband the second one? And you'd rather be silent?" Svetka smiled and lifted her skirt, showing off her plump thighs and her crotch covered with thick hair. "Look, am I not good?" "It's good, but I don't want to go to your harem. I'm sorry." Ivan turned away and went to the spring. "But I'll be silent anyway, don't fuck. But you'd better hide. You've become quite impudent. Didn't the incident with Petka teach you?" "Yes, Koka really wanted to. I didn't fight back. And Petka, it's my fault," Sveta said, passing by Vanya, who was taking water towards the house. "I would have satisfied him. But no, he started bragging." "And in front of whom?" "In front of his own wife, you fool. And she raised a shout to the whole neighborhood. Sergei almost killed me. I barely paid off." "With what? What else?" She giggled and accelerated. Her step disappeared behind a bush, and Ivan glanced at the scarecrow standing nearby and laughed briefly. He was wearing the same sweatshirt. Looking at a thin trickle of water flowing into a bucket from a pipe built into an underground spring, Ivan thought that Nura was still not capable of such a thing. She was kind and soft. She would not burn her husband. But Koka, he's a bastard, and he was already in prison for stabbing his first wife with a knife out of jealousy. It's not true to death. And I've been trying to be Svetka's lover for a long time, since I was young, but she married someone else, and she preferred Petka to a bunch of lovers. A coincidence? Who knows? But the fact is that Kalkina Marinka, a common-law wife, worked for several years as a woman of easy virtue in the city. That's why he's openly cheating on her. "Hello, Vanek. Wait a minute," he shouted from afar. Putting the buckets on the ground, Ivan waited and shook hands with the man who drove up, asked, "Why are you on the truck, and where's the car?" "Yes," she broke down again. "Damn her. How did she fuck me?" And waving his hand, he added in a low voice, "Vanek, rumor, is the key to the house lying there?" "Yeah." The guy smiled slyly. "Who is it this time?" "Tell me too. I have only one." Sergei broke into a wide smile. "Have you arrived yet?" "No. They will arrive tomorrow, and Vitka has accumulated a lot of tasks. He will be on the road," he whispered dreamily. "He will be tanned from the sea. Okay. Your house is yours until Wednesday, and mine on Wednesday, Ivan said, smiling and picking up the buckets went. But turning around, he added, bring clean sheets, they've already run out. It's been noticed. The house was just a stone's throw away, and Ivan walked slowly along the low, but longest fence in the village, surrounding two houses with undetermined plots at once. This was the nickname given to two married couples who had already changed wives several times, not only because they were swingers, they did not even know the word, but because, having started living with one of the Chaptikov brothers, the Ananyev sisters, after a while, began to love exactly the other. Moreover, the brothers and sisters were not twins or twins, but on the contrary, they were very different in height and appearance. They did not make love together, and in general they were very nice guys. But they lived to the point that they finally united the territories, and even the farm and animals began to be kept in common, so as not to find out where whose was. Well, the fact that periodically, once every 6 months or a year, the girls changed places, no one even noticed. For this reason, they haven't had children yet. As for the guys, the villagers had no doubt that everything was fine with them. Everyone had 2 legitimate women and none of them was getting on their nerves. Because as soon as there was a desire to have sex with the brain of a roommate, the girls agreed and helped each other with the move. A dream. When he reached the house, Ivan stopped at the gate, put down the buckets, and lit a cigarette and looked around the neighborhood. It seems that some drunks and horny perverts live on our street, and how did it happen? He grinned, shaking his head, and noticing a neighbor who came out of his yard, onto a bench, nodded affably. Hello, grandfather. You've seen healthier. He cheerfully replied with a wave of his hand. No sooner had the guy entered the shed and put the buckets on the bench than his mother's ass appeared from the open door of the house, and then all of her, who had just finished mopping the floors. Vanya, what were you doing with Maruska at night? Straightening up, she put her hands on her hips, looking sternly at her son's face from the bottom up, and putting the brush in a bucket, rinsed it in the sink and wiped her hands with a small towel. She missed me? It wasn't enough for her. She climbed and climbed. Well, I went out of my way. He doesn't even come every month. Ivan smiled, remembering Maruzha's tender and soft body. She's weak, not like you. Ivan drew his mother to him, and running his hands under her skirt squeezed her strong buttocks. Is there any strength left after that night? Tamara asked playfully, pressing her big breasts against her son. You always have a lot of strength, mother. Ivan replied and greedily kissed the woman. You know, I wouldn't get off you at all. I feel it. The woman replied contentedly and shook her hips, feeling her son's mace rising. Well, let's go to the summer school then. Let's play around. Why wake up the girl? She won't sleep with you the next night. Restless. Of course, she will leave soon. We need to enjoy it in reserve. Ivan did not deny. She hadn't worn underwear in a long time. Ever since her husband, who suddenly left for a very young mistress, left her alone with 2 children. After all, on the very first night, out of revenge, she seduced her grown-up son. It turned out easily. Tamarka was lucky with her body. She ate and did not get fat. So as soon as she offered herself to her son, he gladly attacked the slender mother. Somehow getting out from under him after that first night, Tamara, feeling a terrible, but such a pleasant ache in her literally tired body, and very pleased with the appendage and temperament of her offspring, soon became convinced that she had greatly underestimated his speed. And when he tore his underpants once again, impatiently pulling them off his mother, she stopped wearing them at all, quickly making sure in practice that the decision was correct. Ivan turned out to be not only passionate and impatient, but also preoccupied, loving his own mother every day and more than once, so she herself suggested and put her older sister under him, not really bothering to babble the latter. A little later, Marussia joined in. It would have been impossible to hide what was happening from her. So Tamara told her everything herself, and after a couple of months, with displeasure, but expectedly, she found out that her daughter herself lay down under her son and he could not resist. Fortunately, soon the youngest went to the city to study, and now only on infrequent visits, she pulls Vanya over herself. But still, Tamara was happy to take the lion's share of her son's attacks on her own, fresh and younger to the envy of her friends, and very jealous when Ivan spent time with others. Understanding and humbling herself, She still forced her son to prove in practice who his main woman was, and he proved it over and over again, leaning on his beloved body with pleasure, squeezing out of her, so caressing his ears, the passionate moans of a mother who completely surrendered to her own son. The neighbor, Grandfather Thomas, who was sitting on a bench and squinting blindly around the street, smoking a goat's leg, gave an ironic grunt. Since his youth, distinguished by very good hearing, which has not lost its sharpness over the years, he heard Tamara's long familiar moans that reached him. "Here's a rascal," the grandfather grumbled enviously, under his breath. "Again the mother is chasing, lucky guy." The old man scratched his beard, snorted, and suddenly thought that it was quite likely that his daughter, under his grandson, was moaning now. "There is something to tell Boney when the time comes," grandfather sneered. And continuing to laugh, he grunted to his feet, meeting Fedor, who was paddling with an uneven gait, for another dose of dope.